Police officers in September searching the former home of Lynette Dawson, who disappeared in 1982. A podcast, Teacher's Pet, has sparked interest in the case and a pervasive culture in the 1980s of high school teachers dating students. Dan Hembrecht, TPAFA, Sydney, Australia. The 36-year-old cold case had always been memorable. Lynette Dawson, a nurse and childcare worker, vanished from a suburb of Sydney, leaving two young daughters behind. Days later, her husband, an athlete-turned-teacher, moved in with the couple's 16-year-old babysitter. She was his student, and they were having an affair. These details and others are at the center of Teacher's Pet, a podcast whose investigative journalism has catapulted it to 27 million downloads and the top of the charts of true crime. After almost 4 decades of speculation, the police arrested Chris Dawson, 70, and on Wednesday he is expected to be charged in Sydney with the homicide of his wife. It was an important step forward toward justice for the Dawson family, said Mick Fuller, the New South Wales Police Commissioner. The arrest has vindicated the suspicions of those who believe that Mr. Dawson killed his wife in order to be with his girlfriend. Greg Sims, Mrs. Dawson's brother, told The Australian the family was completely over the moon with the development. Since his wife's disappearance in 1982, Mr. Dawson has maintained his innocence, saying that she abandoned her family. On Wednesday, his family said it was disappointed with the decision, adding, "We have no doubt whatsoever that Chris will be found not guilty as he is innocent." But the podcast has also sparked a conversation for women and men who came of age in the 1980s about a pervasive culture of impunity which enabled Mr. Dawson to date his student. As the podcast has become more popular, former high school students have spoken out about teachers who exploited their positions to intersexual relationships with students, and many adults who turned a blind eye. Mrs. Dawson circa 1980. Her husband, Chris Dawson, moved in with their 16-year-old babysitter shortly after Mrs. Dawson disappeared. Credit via New South Wales Police image. Kate McCauley was one such teenager, at Beacon Hill Public School in the late 1980s, a time when she struggled with problems at home and felt like she was on the periphery. At 14, she said, she was targeted by a male teacher, who began asking her to stay after class and touching her inappropriately. Like Mr. Dawson, he was in a romantic relationship with another woman, one of his former students, Ms. McCauley said. "I just thought it was normal," she said. "Now, looking back, it's not okay. None of it was okay. The extent of the predation was disgusting," she said. "People were more worried about a man's reputation than protecting women." Mrs. Dawson circa 1980. Her husband, Chris Dawson, moved in with their 16-year-old babysitter shortly after Mrs. Dawson disappeared. Now, the silence is breaking. Angered by the lack of consequences and emboldened by the conversation around Teacher's Pet, a class of women and men who grew up targeted by predatory teachers are sharing their stories and calling for accountability. When a man in his 30s has any kind of intimate relationships with a girl who is 16, 17, that's sexual assault, said Robin Wheeler, a former student at Cromer High School, where Mr. Dawson taught his family's babysitter, Joanne Curtis, who was 16 at the time. Ms. Wheeler has led the charge to expose the extent of sexual abuse at the school in the 1980s, and alleged that at least 6 teachers were in relationships with students while she studied there. During an overnight trip for a sporting tournament, she said, teachers brought alcohol and encouraged girls to drink. The environment was compounded by a lack of unwillingness by those in authority to exercise the duty of care, she said, alleging that the Department of Education and the police had turned a blind eye. Since the podcast's release, more people have come forward to share their experiences, and at least 20 teachers have been accused of misconduct. It's been quite cathartic to be able to sit down with some of the people who have been victims and say, "You do realize you did nothing wrong," Ms. Wheeler said. "A woman's life is not indisposable like it was in the past," said Susan Harris-Rimmer, a law professor at Griffith University in Queensland. "I think institutions now have to prove their moral worthiness where they just didn't before." A new police task force was formed in July to investigate these historical sexual assault allegations, The Australian reported. Ms. Wheeler said she had been working with the police investigation into allegations. For those following the case of Mrs. Dawson's disappearance as it grew colder over the decades, the arrest was a shockingly tangible update. In 2001, a coroner's inquest concluded that a known person had killed Mrs. Dawson. A second inquest in 2003 recommended that Mr. Dawson be charged in her death, but the Director of Public Prosecutions declined to press charges, citing a lack of evidence. The case stagnated until 2015, when the police opened another investigation, and in April, officials submitted a new evidence brief to the Director of Public Prosecutions. In September, officials excavated the Dawsons' former house in search of her body, to no avail. The release of Teacher's Bet in May rekindled public interest in the case. The podcast has topped charts in Australia, the United States and Canada, and won Australia's most prestigious journalism award, and its popularity seemed to ramp up with developments in the case. Mr. Dawson, 70, is expected to be charged in connection with his wife's death. The recent interest in the case helped the police uncover new evidence, officials said. On Wednesday, the police thanked the news media and the public for playing a role in the arrest, saying that while the attention was not crucial, the interest had helped them uncover new evidence. They will continue to search for Mrs. Dawson's body. The Dawsons lived in the Northern Beaches district, a suburb of Sydney known for its oceanfront real estate and wealthy residents, and as the original setting for Liane Moriarty's novel-turned-TV show, Big Little Lies, which depicts domestic violence. A lot of beautiful places in Australia have a bit of a dark side, Ms. Harris-Rimmer said. Sitting at a cafe near Dee Beach in the district, Amber Cooper, a local resident, said that as a high school student in 2001, she remembers a phys ed teacher being fired for inappropriate behavior. Everyone knew he was a creep, she said. Because of the #MeToo moment, she said, people are starting to speak up, even though some do not like talking about the problems under the neighborhood's surface. It's a great area, but people don't realize that the problems that happen in bad areas happen here, she said. More recent students, though, said the high schools here seem to be safer now. 5 minutes from the beach, Cromer High School, now named Cromer Campus, stands on a remote road surrounded by tall trees. At the soccer pitch across the street, a few students were waiting for a lesson. I think it was such a long time ago, it doesn't really affect anyone of our age, said James Kane, a 21-year-old coach. He caught bits and pieces of the case through the news, but has never heard of any faculty misconduct at the high schools he attended in the Northern Beaches. It's a good place to grow up, he said. But for those who remember Cromer High School during the 1980s, the experience left scars. Ms. Macaulay said it made her certain that life was better outside of the Northern Beaches. It made me want to find home, or the idea of home elsewhere, she said. At 19, she moved away from Australia, vowing never to live here again. From the outside, I grew up in an idyllic environment, she said. The beaches are so beautiful, we have the sun, the great weather. But part of it was rotten.